Officer Dae-Hyun Kim sat in his patrol cruiser at the edge of Orbital Station Chorus. His eyes narrowed as he watched ships come and go through the busy transit lane. His fingers tapped impatiently on the scanner console as each vessel passed through the checkpoint. After 12 years on the force, Dae-Hyun had developed what he called a sixth sense for trouble, though his colleagues had other names for his selective vigilance. The blue-white glow of the station's artificial atmosphere reflected off his badge as a sleek, charcoal-colored vessel approached. Its smooth lines and quiet engine marked it as expensive, too expensive, Dae-Hyun thought, for a Tehran. The ship's registration flashed on his screen. Tehran Diplomatic Clearance, Class 3 Priority Passage. Not today, he muttered, activating his patrol cruiser's pursuit lights. His scanner hadn't detected any actual violations, but he could always claim irregular energy signatures. It had worked before. Inside the approaching vessel, Judge Joo Park was reviewing her notes for the upcoming trial when the enforcement alert flashed across her navigation screen. She glanced up, her dark eyes reflecting the pulsing red lights of the patrol cruiser. With a soft sigh, she set aside her data tablet and reduced her ship's speed, following standard docking protocols. As her ship eased into the inspection bay, Joo checked her appearance in the reflection of her console. Her Tehran features, the slight blue tint to her skin, the faint ridge along her hairline, were subtle compared to many of her kind. Her mother had been human, her father a Tehran diplomat. In the 30 years since the first contact between Earth and Terra, mixed heritage individuals like herself had become more common, but prejudice remained, especially in the outer stations. Officer Kim approached her ship with deliberate slowness, one hand resting on his pulse pistol. The docking bay cameras recorded everything, as did his body cam, standard procedure that rarely stopped officers like him from finding reasons to harass Terrans. The ship's hatch slid open with a soft hiss. Judge Park stepped out, dressed in formal diplomatic attire that did little to hide her heritage. Identification and travel authorization, Officer Kim demanded without greeting. Judge Park produced her credentials, the gold-edged judicial insignia of the Galactic Federation prominently displayed. I'm Judge Joo Park, en route to the Centauri Summit. I have priority clearance. Officer Kim barely glanced at the credentials. We've had reports of smuggling through this sector. Your ship has been flagged for irregular energy signatures. This was a lie, and they both knew it. Judge Park's vessel had passed through 3 checkpoints already that day without issue. Officer, she said calmly, my ship was cleared by Central Authority less than 6 hours ago. The engines are standard diplomatic issue. Standard for humans. Maybe, Officer Kim replied. Terran modifications aren't always registered properly. Judge Park felt her patience thinning but maintained her composure. She had faced this kind of treatment before, though it was particularly galling given her position and the importance of her current mission. I assure you, there are no modifications. You're welcome to scan the vessel, but I must remind you that delaying a Federation judge en route to an official proceeding is a serious offense. Officer Kim's expression hardened. Are you threatening me? Simply stating facts, Judge Park replied. My credentials are in order. A small crowd of dock workers and travelers had begun to gather at a distance, watching the interaction. Officer Kim noticed and straightened his posture, aware of the audience. Step aside while I inspect your vessel, he ordered, waving his scanner toward the ship. Judge Park complied, though her posture remained dignified. As a judge, she understood the importance of following proper procedure, even when the officer before her was clearly abusing his authority. Officer Kim made a show of thoroughly scanning the ship's exterior, paying special attention to the engine compartment. Finding nothing, he moved to the cargo hold, where Judge Park had stored only her personal effects and legal documents for the upcoming trial. What's in this case? He demanded, pointing to a secured metal container. Court documents, classified under Federation Judicial Code Section 47B. Judge Park answered. Officer Kim reached for the case. Officer, Judge Park said firmly, Those documents are sealed by order of the High Court. Breaking that seal without proper authorization is punishable by up to 5 years in a Federation detention facility. The officer's hand hesitated. Even in his prejudice, he wasn't foolish enough to directly violate High Court orders on camera. "I need to verify the contents," he insisted, trying to save face. "You may scan it," Judge Park offered reasonably, "but the seal remains intact." As Officer Kim ran his scanner over the case, his console beeped with an incoming message. The station supervisor, Sun-Ho Lee, appeared on the small screen. "Officer Kim, what's the delay with that diplomatic vessel? We've received an inquiry from Central Command about Judge Park's whereabouts." Officer Kim's expression froze. "Routine inspection, sir. The ship was flagged for." "That ship has highest level clearance," Supervisor Lee interrupted. "Judge Park is expected at the Centauri Summit to preside over the Interspecies Rights Treaty negotiations. Complete your inspection immediately." The communication ended abruptly, leaving Officer Kim standing awkwardly beside the case he had been so eager to open. The gathered onlookers murmured among themselves, several recording the interaction with their personal devices. Judge Park said nothing, waiting patiently as Officer Kim struggled with his embarrassment and anger. "Your ship appears to be in order," he finally said stiffly. "You're free to proceed." "Thank you, officer," Judge Park replied with dignified composure. Before returning to her ship, she added, "You might want to check your scanner's calibration. False flags waste everyone's time." As she turned to board her vessel, emergency lights began flashing throughout the station. The public announcement system activated with a high-priority broadcast. "Attention all personnel and travelers. A diplomatic emergency has been declared in the Centauri system. All judicial officers are requested to report immediately. Judge Ju Park of the Federation High Court is to be given immediate passage to Centauri Station Alpha." Officer Kim stood frozen as the message repeated. The onlookers now openly stared at Judge Park, recognition dawning on their faces. She wasn't just any judge. She was one of the most senior members of the Federation High Court, selected personally to oversee the historic treaty negotiations. Judge Park turned back to face Officer Kim, her expression neither triumphant nor angry, simply resolute. "It appears I'm needed urgently, officer. Perhaps we can continue this discussion another time." Judge Ju Park settled back into the pilot's seat of her vessel as the docking clamps released. Despite the emergency alert, Officer Dae-Yeon Kim was not ready to let her go so easily. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the ship's hatch. "One moment, Judge," he said. "My inspection isn't complete. Protocol states that all vessels, even diplomatic ones, must undergo full security clearance before departure during an emergency situation." This was another lie. Emergency protocols actually prioritized the swift departure of officials like Judge Park. Both of them knew this, but Officer Kim was determined to save face after the public embarrassment. Judge Park took a deep breath. The fate of the Interspecies Rights Treaty hung in the balance, and every minute delayed could have serious consequences. She stepped back out of her ship. "Officer Kim," she said calmly, checking his name badge, "I understand you're doing your job, but there are 3 billion people across 5 systems waiting for this treaty to be ratified. Lives depend on it." Officer Kim's face remained hard. "Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone, even Terrans who think they're above the law." A few gasps came from the onlookers who had not dispersed despite the emergency alert. Judge Park noticed several people recording the interaction with their personal devices. "I don't consider myself above any law," she replied evenly. "But I am tasked with interpreting and applying those laws fairly, something you might want to consider in your own work." Officer Kim's face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting I'm not doing my job properly?" "I'm suggesting that your scanner flagged a perfectly normal diplomatic vessel without cause, and now you're delaying an emergency response based on a protocol that doesn't exist." Judge Park maintained her composure, though her patience was wearing thin. Officer Kim stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We both know what you people do. Diplomatic credentials are easy to fake. Terrans have been smuggling illegal tech through this sector for months. Judge Park raised an eyebrow. You people. I was born on Earth. Officer Kim. My mother was from Busan. I studied law at the United Earth Academy before the Federation even existed. Doesn't change what you are, Officer Kim muttered, just loud enough for his body camera to pick up. Before Judge Park could respond, the station doors slid open and 3 officials hurried in. The lead figure, a tall woman with commander insignia, looked furious. Officer Kim, stand down immediately. Commander Mina Kang's voice echoed through the docking bay. She was the head of station security, and not someone to be trifled with. Officer Kim stiffened but didn't move away from Judge Park's ship. I'm conducting a standard security inspection, Commander. There is nothing standard about detaining the High Judge of the Federation during a diplomatic emergency, Commander Kang replied sharply. She turned to Judge Park with a respectful nod. I apologize for this delay, Your Honor. Your presence is urgently needed at Centauri. Judge Park nodded graciously. Thank you, Commander. I understand Officer Kim is concerned about station security. Commander Kang's gaze hardened as she looked back at Officer Kim. Report to my office immediately after your shift, officer. Now step away from the judge's vessel. Officer Kim hesitated, then reluctantly moved aside. But as Judge Park turned to board her ship again, he couldn't resist one final jab. Must be nice having friends in high places, he said quietly. Judge Park paused. The emergency was pressing, but something about this officer's persistent prejudice made her turn back. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger despite the emergency alerts. Officer Kim, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I don't know what experiences have shaped your views, but they're clouding your judgment. The Federation was founded on the principle that all sentient beings deserve equal treatment under the law. Easy to say when your kind helped write those laws, Officer Kim retorted. My kind. Judge Park's voice remained steady. Judges? Lawyers? Or do you mean Terrans? Because the laws I uphold protect humans, Terrans, and every other species in the Federation equally, including you. The docking bay had fallen completely silent. Even Commander Kang stood back, allowing the judge to speak. The treaty I'm traveling to oversee will ensure that mixed-species children won't face the discrimination I've experienced. It will protect refugees from the Outer Rim wars. It will establish new medical protocols for cross-species care. Judge Park stepped closer to Officer Kim. And yes, it will strengthen regulations against prejudicial enforcement of security protocols. Officer Kim's face flushed deeper, but he said nothing. I could file a formal complaint about your conduct today, Judge Park continued. It would be reviewed by the Federation Security Council. Your body camera footage would be examined. The statements of these witnesses would be taken. She gestured to the crowd around them. Officer Kim swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how many people were watching and recording. But that would take time. Time that could be better spent ensuring justice for all Federation citizens. Judge Park's expression softened slightly. Instead, I have a different proposal. Commander Kang looked at Judge Park with surprise. Your Honor, given the emergency. Judge Park held up a hand. This will only take a moment, Commander. She turned back to Officer Kim. Officer, you clearly have strong opinions about Terrans and other non-humans. Have you ever actually worked with any? Not just processed them through security, but truly collaborated with them. Officer Kim's silence was answer enough. Then I invite you to accompany me to Centauri Station, Judge Park said, causing murmurs to ripple through the crowd. What? Officer Kim looked genuinely shocked. As a security escort, Judge Park clarified, you can complete your inspection en route and observe the treaty negotiations firsthand. See what's really at stake beyond this docking bay. Commander Kang looked uncertain. Your Honor, is that wise? Sometimes the best cure for prejudice is exposure. Commander, Judge Park replied. She looked directly at Officer Kim. What do you say, officer? Are you brave enough to see the Federation as it truly is, not just as you imagine it to be? Officer Kim stood frozen, caught between his pride and his professional duty. The emergency lights continued to flash overhead. The entire docking bay waited for his answer. "I'll need clearance from my supervisor," he finally said. Commander Kang sighed. "Granted, but you'll be representing Station Chorus, Officer Kim. I expect exemplary behavior." Judge Park nodded. "My ship departs in 5 minutes, with or without you, Officer Kim. The choice is yours." She turned and boarded her vessel without looking back, leaving Officer Kim standing at the threshold of a decision that would change the course of his life. Officer Dae-Hyun Kim sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Judge Park's diplomatic vessel. He had made his decision with only seconds to spare, rushing aboard just as the docking clamps released. Now, as the ship accelerated away from orbital station Chorus, he struggled to hide his discomfort. "Have you ever traveled by diplomatic courier before, officer?" Judge Park asked, her hands moving efficiently over the control panel. "No," he replied curtly. "Security officers don't usually get invited to fancy diplomatic missions." Judge Park nodded. "Then this will be educational for both of us. I've never had a security escort with such strong opinions about my heritage." The ship entered hyperspace with a brief flash of light. Officer Kim gripped his seat as the stars stretched into long lines outside the viewports. "I don't have a problem with Terrans," he said defensively. "I just believe in proper security protocols." Judge Park raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Instead, she activated the ship's communication system. "This is Federation High Judge Park requesting secure channel to Centauri Station Alpha." The screen flickered to life, showing a worried-looking official. "Judge Park. Thank goodness. The situation has escalated since our last communication. The Verisan delegation is threatening to withdraw completely. I'll be there in under an hour, Director Hoon. Please assure them that all treaty concerns will be addressed fairly." "And who is that with you?" the director asked, noticing Officer Kim. "Officer Dae-Hyun Kim of Orbital Station Chorus. He's accompanying me as an observer." The director looked confused, but nodded. "Very well. We've prepared your chambers. The emergency session begins as soon as you arrive." As the communication ended, Officer Kim frowned. "What exactly is this emergency about?" "More special privileges for non-humans." Judge Park turned to face him fully. "The Interspecies Rights Treaty is the most comprehensive legislation ever attempted in the Federation. It addresses everything from medical care to property rights to family law. And yes, it ensures that all sentient species have equal protection under Federation law." "Sounds like politics to me," Officer Kim muttered. "It's justice," Judge Park corrected. "Let me show you something." She touched a few controls, and a holographic display appeared between them. It showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with features similar to Judge Park's, subtle Terran characteristics mixed with human ones. "This is Mina," Judge Park said softly. "Her mother was human, her father Terran. When both parents died in the Proxima mining accident 3 years ago, neither human nor Terran authorities would take responsibility for her care. She spent 18 months in an orbital processing center because there were no clear laws about custody of mixed-species children." Officer Kim shifted uncomfortably. "That's unfortunate. But she wasn't alone." Judge Park continued, and the hologram expanded to show dozens of children of various mixed heritages. "There are thousands like her throughout the Federation. This treaty will ensure they have homes, education, and rights." Before Officer Kim could respond, the ship's alert system chimed. Judge Park quickly checked the readings. "We're being hailed by a Federation peacekeeping vessel," she said, sounding surprised. The communication screen activated again, showing a stern human captain. "Judge Park, this is Captain Jiho Lee of the Federation vessel Peacekeeper. We've been ordered to provide you with additional security. There have been threats against the treaty delegates." Judge Park frowned. "What kind of threats, Captain?" "A radical group calling themselves Pure Earth has made specific threats against non-human delegates and those they consider sympathizers. The captain's eyes flicked briefly to Judge Park's Terran features. Officer Kim straightened in his seat. Pure Earth. They're terrorists. Both Judge Park and Captain Lee looked at him with surprise. You're familiar with this group, officer? Judge Park asked. Officer Kim nodded grimly. They've attacked shipping lanes near our station twice in the past year. They target any vessel with non-human crew or cargo. They're dangerous extremists. And they're now threatening the treaty negotiations, Captain Lee confirmed. We'll escort you to Centauri Station Alpha. Your security clearance has been upgraded to Level 1. After the captain signed off, a tense silence filled the ship. Judge Park studied Officer Kim thoughtfully. You seemed genuinely concerned about Pure Earth, she observed. Officer Kim scowled. I hate terrorists. They give humans a bad name. So you acknowledge that they don't represent all humans, just as criminal Terrans don't represent all Terrans. Officer Kim opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The point was too logical to dispute. The rest of the journey passed in relative silence, with the Federation peacekeeping vessel visible through the viewport, flying alongside them. As they approached Centauri Station Alpha, Officer Kim couldn't help but be impressed by the massive space station. It dwarfed Orbital Station Chorus, with gleaming towers and multiple docking rings. This is the heart of the Federation, Judge Park explained as they began docking procedures. Representatives from every member species work here. As their ship docked, Officer Kim got his first shock. The welcoming committee included not just humans, but a diverse array of species, some he recognized, others he'd only seen in broadcasts. Tall, willowy Veracins with their silver skin, stocky Dothans with their multiple eyes, and several Terrans, their blue-tinted skin varying in shade and intensity. Judge Park, thank goodness you've arrived, said a distinguished-looking Terran. Stepping forward, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Ambassador Sung, this is Officer Kim from Orbital Station Chorus, Judge Park introduced. He'll be observing our proceedings. The ambassador gave Officer Kim a courteous nod, which he awkwardly returned. It was the first time a non-human had greeted him with such respect. We should proceed directly to the chamber, another delegate said urgently. The Veracin Prime Minister is threatening to leave within the hour if their security concerns aren't addressed. As they hurried through the station corridors, Officer Kim found himself surrounded by the greatest diversity of species he had ever encountered. What surprised him most was how ordinary it all seemed. Different beings working together, sharing space, engaged in the business of governance. The main treaty chamber took his breath away. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species filled the circular room, their voices creating a symphony of languages that the universal translators struggled to keep up with. Judge Park was led to an elevated platform in the center. Delegates of the Federation, she announced, her voice amplified throughout the chamber. I understand your concerns. The threats against this gathering are real, but so is our commitment to justice for all beings. As she spoke, Officer Kim noticed movement in the upper gallery. Something about it seemed wrong, furtive, purposeful. He scanned the area more carefully and spotted a figure in maintenance coveralls adjusting what looked like a security camera. But station security didn't use that model, and the person's movements were too hurried. Years of security training kicked in. Officer Kim moved quickly toward Judge Park, touching his communicator. Security alert in the main chamber. Possible threat in the upper gallery, north quadrant. Judge Park paused mid-sentence as Officer Kim reached her side. The figure in the gallery pulled something from their coveralls, not a tool, but a compact energy weapon. Everyone down. Officer Kim shouted, pulling Judge Park behind the podium just as an energy pulse blasted through the space where she had been standing. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Security forces rushed in as delegates took cover. Officer Kim kept his body positioned between Judge Park and the direction of the attack. You saved my life, Judge Park said, her eyes wide with surprise. Officer Kim shook his head. I'm just doing my job. For all Federation citizens. And in that moment, as security officers apprehended the would-be assassin, Officer Kim realized something had changed within him. The person he had protected was not a Terran judge, but simply a judge, a person worthy of the same protection as any other. The emergency security lockdown lasted 3 hours after the assassination attempt. Officer Dae-hyun Kim sat in a small conference room adjacent to the main treaty chamber, giving his statement to the Federation security team. His quick actions had prevented what could have been a diplomatic catastrophe. "You noticed the assassin when our own security team missed them," said Chief Security Officer Min Soo-yoon, looking impressed. "What made you suspicious?" Officer Kim shrugged. The maintenance uniform didn't match station protocols, and their movements were too purposeful. Maintenance crews usually look bored, not focused. Chief Yoon nodded. "Good instincts. The assassin has been identified as a pure Earth operative. They specifically targeted Judge Park." Officer Kim felt a strange twist in his stomach at these words. Just hours ago, he had been harassing Judge Park based on her Terran heritage. Now, he had saved her from someone who wanted her dead for the same reason. "Is the judge all right?" he asked. "She's fine, thanks to you. She's requested to see you once we're finished here." When the debriefing ended, Officer Kim was escorted to Judge Park's private chambers. The room was simple but elegant, with a large window overlooking the stars. Judge Park stood looking out at the view, still dressed in her formal robes. "Officer Kim," she said, turning to face him. "Please come in." He entered awkwardly, suddenly very aware of how he had treated her earlier that day. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said. "Your actions saved not just my life, but possibly the treaty itself." "I was just doing my job," he replied stiffly. Judge Park smiled slightly. "That's twice you've said that today. Once when delaying me at the checkpoint, and once when saving my life. Interesting how differently you interpreted your job in those situations." Officer Kim looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "About what happened at the station, I was wrong." "Were you?" Judge Park asked. "Or were you simply acting on beliefs you've held for a long time?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "Both, I suppose." Judge Park gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. The emergency session has been postponed until tomorrow, while security is reinforced. I'd like to use this time to continue our previous conversation." Officer Kim sat reluctantly. He had expected a reprimand, maybe even charges for his behavior at the checkpoint. This calm conversation was somehow more unsettling. "The man who tried to kill me today believes that humans and non-humans cannot coexist," Judge Park said. "That the Federation itself is a mistake." "What do you believe, Officer Kim?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I believed that non-humans were taking advantage of the system, that they were getting special treatment. And now." Officer Kim thought about the diverse delegates he had seen working together, about the children in the hologram who needed protection, about Judge Park herself who had invited him here despite his prejudice. "I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. Judge Park nodded. "That's a good start. Doubt can be the beginning of wisdom." She pressed a button on her desk. "I have a proposal for you." A holographic document appeared between them. "This is a temporary reassignment order. If you agree, you'll be assigned to the treaty security detail for the next 2 weeks. You'll see firsthand what this treaty is actually about." Officer Kim stared at the document in surprise. "You want me to stay here, after how I treated you?" "Sometimes the best way to change a perspective is to broaden it," Judge Park replied. "Besides, you've proven yourself observant and quick-thinking. We need those qualities." The following day, Officer Kim stood guard during the emergency session. He watched as Judge Park masterfully guided the negotiation process, addressing each delegation's concerns with patience and wisdom. The Verisan Prime Minister, a tall, silver-skinned being, seemed particularly animated in his objections. "The pure Earth attack proves our point," the Prime Minister argued. "Many humans still reject our very existence. How can this treaty protect us?" Judge Park remained calm. "The actions of extremists do not define a species. Officer Kim here is human, and he risked his life to protect this gathering. The treaty will strengthen our ability to prosecute hate groups like Pure Earth, while ensuring all beings have equal protection. Officer Kim felt the eyes of the delegates turn to him. For the first time in his life, he was being held up as an example of human virtue rather than prejudice. The feeling was uncomfortable but not unpleasant. As the days passed, Officer Kim was assigned to various treaty working groups. He escorted delegates to meetings, stood guard during sensitive negotiations, and gradually began to see the Federation through new eyes. In the medical rights session, he learned that Terran blood could treat certain human genetic disorders, but many Terrans were afraid to register as donors because of discrimination. In the Education Committee, he saw holographic testimonies from children of mixed species heritage who had been denied schooling. On the fifth day, he was assigned to Judge Park's personal security detail. They were walking to the housing section when they passed a group of human maintenance workers. One of them glared at Judge Park and muttered something under his breath. Officer Kim stopped abruptly. "What did you say?" The worker looked surprised. "Nothing, officer." "I heard what you said," Officer Kim replied firmly. "Judge Park is a Federation high judge and deserves your respect." Mixed responses, he admitted. Some thought I'd betrayed them by joining the alien lovers. Others were just surprised. They reached the lecture hall where 60 cadets waited. Humans, Terrans, Verisons, and several other species Lieutenant Kim had come to recognize over the past months. "Before we go in," Judge Park said, "I have something for you." She handed him a small data chip. "The Federation Council approved this morning. I thought you might want to see it first." Lieutenant Kim inserted the chip into his tablet and read the document that appeared. His eyes widened. "The Daehyun Kim Protocol. They named it after me." Judge Park nodded. "The new mandatory training program for all Federation security personnel. It uses your experience as a case study in overcoming bias." Lieutenant Kim felt a complex mix of emotions, pride tinged with embarrassment, honor shadowed by the memory of his past behavior. "I'm not sure I deserve this," he said quietly. "It wasn't my decision," Judge Park replied. "But I supported it. Sometimes the most powerful teaching tools come from real transformation, not theoretical ideals." Inside the lecture hall, the cadets stood respectfully as Judge Park and Lieutenant Kim entered. They took their positions at the front of the room. "Good morning," Judge Park began. "Today's session is about more than regulations or procedures. It's about the heart of Federation justice, seeing beyond our differences to recognize our common rights and responsibilities." She nodded to Lieutenant Kim, who stepped forward. Looking at the diverse faces before him, he remembered how uncomfortable such a sight had once made him. Now, it felt like opportunity. 6 months ago, he began, I was stationed at Orbital Station Chorus. I believed my job was to protect humans from the influence and threats of other species. I was wrong. The cadets listened intently as Lieutenant Kim shared his story. The checkpoint confrontation, the emergency journey to Centauri, the assassination attempt, and most importantly, his changing perspective. "I thought I was upholding the law," he explained, "but I was actually undermining its most fundamental principle, equal justice for all sentient beings." During the interactive portion of the lecture, a young Terran cadet raised his hand. "Lieutenant, what would you say to officers who still hold the beliefs you once did?" Lieutenant Kim considered the question carefully. "I would tell them what Judge Park showed me. That justice isn't about protecting your kind from others. It's about ensuring everyone receives the same treatment, regardless of their species, appearance, or origin." After the lecture, several cadets approached to ask additional questions. Lieutenant Kim noticed a human cadet hanging back, looking uncertain. When the others had gone, the young man stepped forward. "Sir, I grew up on an outer colony that had conflicts with Terran settlers," the cadet said hesitantly. "Sometimes I find myself thinking like you used to. Does that mean I shouldn't be here?" Lieutenant Kim placed a hand on the cadet's shoulder. "It means you have an opportunity to grow, just as I did. Awareness is the first step." Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Kim met Judge Park in the Academy Gardens. The Earth's setting sun cast a golden glow over the carefully maintained landscape where plants from various Federation worlds grew side by side. "You did well today," Judge Park said. "The cadets responded to your honesty." "It still feels strange," Lieutenant Kim admitted, "talking about my mistakes so openly." "Those mistakes have become valuable now," she replied. "They're helping others avoid the same path." They walked in companionable silence for a moment. Lieutenant Kim thought about how much had changed since their first encounter. "There's a new assignment opening up," he said finally. "Federation Security is establishing an outreach program for colonies with interspecies tensions. They need officers with experience in conflict resolution." Judge Park smiled. "Are you considering it?" "I've already applied," he said. "It would mean traveling to some of the most divided communities in the Federation, places like where that cadet today grew up." "It won't be easy," Judge Park cautioned. "Some of those colonies have decades of mistrust to overcome." "I know," Lieutenant Kim replied. "But 6 months ago, I thought my views could never change. If I could transform, perhaps they can too." As they reached the center of the garden, they came upon a newly installed monument, a simple stone sphere with the Federation emblem, and the text of the treaty's preamble engraved in multiple languages. Lieutenant Kim paused to read the familiar words. "We recognize that true justice transcends the boundaries of worlds, species, and traditions," he recited. "In our diversity, we find strength. In our differences, we find perspective. In our unity, we find peace." Judge Park nodded approvingly. "Words you now embody, Lieutenant Kim." The following week, Lieutenant Kim received notification that his application had been accepted. He would lead a team of 6 officers, each from a different species, on a tour of the outer colonies. Their mission was to implement the Daehyun Kim Protocol and help bridge divides between different communities. On the day of his departure, he visited Orbital Station Chorus one last time. Commander Kang met him at the docking bay, the same one where he had first confronted Judge Park. "The station won't be the same without you," Commander Kang said as they shook hands. "Though I admit, the new you takes some getting used to." Lieutenant Kim smiled. "I'm still getting used to it myself." As his ship prepared for departure, Lieutenant Kim looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there were people holding the same fears and prejudices he once had. People who might, with the right guidance, experience the same transformation. His communication console beeped with an incoming message. Judge Park appeared on the screen. "I wanted to wish you luck before you left," she said, "and to tell you something important." "What's that?" Lieutenant Kim asked. 6 months ago, I could have filed charges against you for your conduct at the checkpoint. It would have been the expected response." Lieutenant Kim nodded solemnly. "I've often wondered why you didn't." "Because punishment doesn't always lead to understanding," Judge Park replied. "Sometimes opportunity does." "You proved that theory correct, Lieutenant Kim. Now go prove it again." As his ship pulled away from the station, Lieutenant Kim reflected on the journey ahead. He was no longer the officer who had pulled over a Terran judge because of prejudice. He was now a teacher, a guide for others seeking the same understanding he had found. The greatest lesson Judge Park had taught him wasn't about law or regulations. It was that true justice wasn't found in punishment, but in transformation. And transformation began with one person willing to see beyond their own limited perspective. That was his mission now, not merely to enforce the law, but to change hearts and minds, one encounter at a time.